Biblical scriptures in Latin were a predominant component to early Christianity in the Western Mediterranean world. The collective text within the Vetus Latina, and later the Latin Vulgate, became the foundation for the earliest English Bibles, including the renowned and fundamental King James Version. While the early Greek codices, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and Sinaiticus, contributed directly to the modern-day Bibles, English Revised Version, the American Standard Version, and the Revised Standard Version, the early Latin translations led to the very first English Bibles, such as the Tyndale, Great, and Geneva Bibles, and ultimately onto the King James Version Bible. The spread of Christianity across the Mediterranean world during the 1st and 2nd centuries brought with it the written text of the Scriptures. Greek was the widely established language in the Eastern Mediterranean. However, with the expansion of the Roman Empire, Latin had become the predominant and official language around much of the Mediterranean Sea, especially in the western areas. Many of the available Christian scripture Greek manuscripts were translated into Latin. This effort began as early as the 2nd century, although those earliest Latin translations unfortunately no longer exist. The Greek to Latin scripture translations continued for the next several centuries across many different Christian communities in both the northern and southern Mediterranean areas. These early Latin translations collectively became known as the Vetus Latina, or Old Latin, even though they were written in a more classical or post-classical Latin style rather than actual Old Latin. The legacy and impact of those early Latin translations has formed much of the Christian established biblical literary works we have today. Vetus Latina. Vetus Latina is not an individual manuscript, but rather a series of different Greek to Latin translations. The translations occurred between the 2nd and 4th centuries, with the earliest extant manuscript dating to around 350 CE. While no 2nd or 3rd century examples of the Vetus Latina have survived, evidence of their existence is available from the early church fathers Tertullian and Cyprian, who reference those earlier Vetus Latina manuscripts in their own writings in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Of the three primary text criticism text types, Alexandrian, Byzantine, and Western, the Greek source text used for the Vetus Latina translations is considered to be Western in nature. While Alexandrian text type tends to be more terse and direct, lacks literary polish, and can sometimes be more challenging to read, Western type text is much less controlled, and authors are found to occasionally paraphrase sections rather than adhere to strict literal translations. The most influential extant Vetus Latina version is the Codex Bezae. Codex Bezae is a Greek-Latin diglot consisting of both the source Greek and the translated Latin text. It's written on parchment, a prepared goat or sheepskin, and a single column per page face layout. The text is written in an uncial majuscule script, which was an earlier preferred form of writing comprised entirely of capital letters. Manuscripts created around the 9th century and later were more often written in minuscule script style using lowercase letters. The Greek portion of the text contains a few rudimentary punctuation marks with occasional word separations. The Latin portion of the text contains no punctuation or word separations. The original scribe or scribes that created the Codex Bezae is unknown. However, analysis of the text suggests that at later dates, as many as 11 different editing scribes have updated the text of the manuscript over multiple occasions between the 6th and 12th centuries. The original codex has been dated to around 400 CE. However, many biblical historians place it more broadly in the 5th century. The exact origin of Codex Bezae is unknown. However, some possible general locations that have been suggested are the western Mediterranean regions around what is now known as Spain and Italy, or the southern Mediterranean region of Egypt, or other northern African areas. In other words, there is no consensus on the origin of the Codex, other than it was most likely not an Eastern Mediterranean work. Codex Bezae contains the majority of the 4 Gospels, with only the Gospel of Luke existing in its entirety. The Gospels are presented in the order Matthew, John, Luke, and then Mark. Also included in the Codex is a portion of Acts and the 3rd Epistle of John. Examination of the Greek and Latin text in the Codex shows an inconsistent parallelism between the sides, with the Latin text not always being a congruent translation of the provided Greek. The Latin includes several instances of spelling errors and improper grammar, suggesting a careless or hurried effort. Some scholars have suggested the scribe was only a Latin copyist that had limited knowledge of the Greek language and translation practices. One way to characterize and compare an early collection of scripture text is by noting which sections of the text have been added and which ones have been excluded. 3 examples of differing text sections are the Johannine comma Trinity verses of 1 John chapter 5 verses 7 and 8, the ending of the Gospel of Mark, long or short, and the story of the adulterous woman, John 7:53 through 8:11. Codex Bezae does not include the Johannine comma, because the 1 John text is not present. However, the long ending of the Gospel of Mark is included. Most scholars believe the long ending to Mark in the Codex was added at a later date and was not part of the original text. Codex Bezae is one of the few early biblical texts that includes the story of the adulterous woman, John 7:53 through 8:11, otherwise known as the Pericope Adulterae. None of the early Greek codices, including Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, include the story of the adulterous woman. Other codices exist as different versions of the Vetus Latina. Latin Vulgate. For more than a century after the first creation of the Vetus Latina, many different versions of the translated Latin scriptures were created by multiple individuals, possessing varying degrees of capability and competency. The many translations were assembled and edited without common direction or quality, and on the whole did not offer a unified and consistent representation of the scriptures. Pope Damasus I found that the many churches across the Western Christian world were utilizing different Vetus Latina scripture text that was inconsistent across those churches and lacked a desired common message. He recognized that lack of consistency needed to change. In 382, Pope Damasus commissioned Jerome of Stridon to update and revise the Vetus Latina Gospels, currently being used as part of the Roman Church service, and create a new and consistent translation of those scriptures. He instructed Jerome to reference the older Greek manuscripts to realign and update the text in the Vetus Latina. As requested, Jerome first worked on the Gospels, but later expanded his efforts to include updates for the majority of the remaining sections in both the Old and New Testaments. The consolidation and revision work performed by Jerome became known later as the Latin Vulgate, or simply Vulgate for short. The Latin term Vulgate referred to the common speech and community of the common people rather than that of the high society groups or nobility. While Jerome performed the majority of the updates and corrections to the text, other individuals also contributed modifications, and some sections were taken directly from the Vetus Latina unchanged. The first original version of the Latin Vulgate by Jerome did not include the Johannine comma. However, it did include the long ending of the Gospel of Mark. Also absent in the original version of the Vulgate is the story of the adulterous woman, known as the Pericope Adulterae. In later years, the Latin Vulgate was amended to include both the Johannine Comma and the Pericope Adulterae. The New Testament Greek text used in the Latin Vulgate has been identified as primarily being of text type Western, although some of the text retranslated from the older Greek manuscripts retain some of its Byzantine characteristics. The Latin Vulgate did not immediately replace the Vetus Latina. Gradually, over several centuries, the churches and Christian communities began to rely more on the Vulgate as their preferred rendition of the Scriptures. In 1546, the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent officially established the Vulgate as authoritative. Because the Latin Vulgate ultimately became the predominant and most widely utilized revision of Latin scriptures across the Western Christian world, it heavily influenced the eventual development of English Bibles. The earliest English Bibles directly descending from the Latin Vulgate text include the Wycliffe Bible, the Tyndale Bible, the Great Bible, and the Geneva Bible, which then influenced the creation of the Bishop's Bible. In 1611, the translated text of the Latin Vulgate, deemed authoritative by the Catholic Church, made its way into what is considered the grandfather of English Bibles, the original King James Version. Collectively, these Bibles laid the foundation for a great number of the modern Bibles we have today. The earliest biblical scriptures translated into Latin within the Vetus Latina and later the Latin Vulgate were a predominant component to early Christianity in the Western Mediterranean communities. They have directly contributed to and influenced the progression of Christianity worldwide.